Mark Miller is Canada's Minister of Indigenous Services. You see him there. Minister Miller, first of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Listen, let's start. How will a website fulfill the government's promise to end all drinking water advisories in First Nations communities?
Well, in November, when we announced the additional $1.5 billion to communities to support them in the long-term asset stability of what is a critical infrastructure in their communities, we recognized that COVID had posed some challenges, but people were also requiring detailed information as to what's happening in each community that remains on long-term water advisories. And I undertook the Canadians in November to do that, making sure that we had as much, I'm trying to get Canadians to see what I'm seeing, what our department is seeing in the work that we're doing with communities. The difference we sort of have today vis-a-vis the situation we had in 2015 is that now we have plans in place. We have 101 long-term water advisories lifted with some to go, but we're really down to the short strokes. And people want to see what I see, what's going on in communities, what the plan is, most importantly, to lift those advisories. So that's the effort behind the website.
Well, so what precisely will we see that you see? What precisely does this website do?
Most notably, from an aggregate perspective, we'll give a sense of what's the commitment was been, the life cycle of lifting a long-term water advisory, and then a community-by-community breakdown of the ones that are remaining and the commitments we've made and the plan that they have in place in order to lift it. There are absolutely challenges, but there's absolutely the commitment of the Government of Canada to get it done. And I'll be following up, and I'm following up with communities directly to give them that assurance and much past the March 2021 deadline that we've all spoken so much about, but really for the long-term life cycle of an asset that is so critical to people's well-being.
I'm wondering, like, who it's for, who asked for it. Did First Nations communities want this? Those communities know how bad their water is and how long it's taking to fix it. So who's it for? Who needs to know this information?
It's for all Canadians and all Indigenous peoples living in Canada. I celebrated today the 100th and the 101 list of two communities that have been fighting for so long to get clean water into their community. But they also, while it is a moment of great joy and pride for them, have expressed concern about the remaining situation in Canada. And this is the best country in the world, yet we have that. We have the reality that we live with in terms of the remaining long-term water advisories. So any Canadian can look at it, the media can look at it, and people that have sometimes questioned the commitment can go there and see that each community has a plan and what the process is in place to getting it lifted as quickly as possible.
As you know, there have been calls from some quarters for the government to identify, best described, I suppose, as shoddy contractors who've worked on some of these projects, and that's been part of the problem. Why doesn't the website identify those contractors so they can be avoided?
Yeah, and look, this is an ongoing discussion that we have, Peter. This has been a matter of some controversy in how contracting is done. The Government of Canada, Indigenous Services Canada, doesn't impose contractors on communities. There is a whole process involved there. And so this is a delicate question. And first and foremost, investigating what's gone wrong. That was a demand that we that we agreed to look into as part of Niskandaga, which their water challenges that we agreed to do in the fall. And we will continue to investigate those practices and work with communities to avoid sharp practices and shoddy craftsmanship. But it is something that is of concern to me. But in terms of a blanket recommendation from the Government of Canada as who to use and who not to use, that's something that is a little more delicate in nature and has to be done with communities in question in their tendering process.
Okay, so each community will have its own, as I understand it, own web page on the government site, a detailed plan and progress report. I mean, that's all good, but what the Auditor General identified as the key problem is insufficient funding and a 30-year-old funding policy and a lack of a legal framework forcing the government to meet its obligations to fix the drinking water problem. So what's the plan to deal with those failings?
Well, if you'll recall, Peter, we announced in November, and it's something that my team and I saw as we looked at what are the answers to providing that long-term stability for water assets in communities as we face the historic pandemic, and that was in part the funding amounts that were announced in November to address not only the long-term needs of communities and operations and maintenance, but also what is an outdated formula that was funding only water operators and operations from the Government of Canada to the communities for 80%, leaving the communities to come up with a 20%, which they didn't necessarily have. And so we're fixing that. It's an outdated policy. We've recognized that, and we're getting rid of it. On the second point, on the legislative framework, recall the great controversy in and around the legislation that former Prime Minister Harper put into place was decried as colonial, without the resources in place to lift the water advisories. So that is a regulatory framework that needs to be fixed in conjunction with Indigenous communities, and we are doing so with the AFN and rights holders. It is a bit of a longer process, but I don't want to leave Canadians with the impression that there is a legal void. There isn't. There are standards to be upheld, and Indigenous Services Canada works with those communities to make sure that water is tested, clean, and safe for their community.
All right. So, as you know, I think many Canadians following this story know, this March was the deadline for ending all these drinking water advisories. That deadline we know is going to come and go. You are, to be fair, making significant progress. I think the number you said today is 63%. Of those boil water advisories have been lifted now. What's your new deadline for ending all of the remaining drinking water advisories?
Well, Peter, it should be no shock to anyone that we've lost close to a construction season due to COVID. We can't underestimate the impact that may currently have on deadlines. There are a number of communities that are producing clean waters and are not in that 64%. That you identified that are producing clean water and are ready to lift. But in the case of some of them, they're also ones that are on lockdown, and they have to reorient their priorities. We'll work with them through this. I'm cautiously optimistic about how the course of the summer will go, and then Canadians will be able to see for themselves exactly what communities are remaining and when the plans are in place.
Right, but do you believe by this time next year that this will be fixed?
I believe this will be a much different conversation by that time.
All right, I want to finish on one other area here. The chief of the James Smith Cree Nation in Saskatchewan has said he's working on a deal to procure COVID-19 vaccine made by AstraZeneca through a third party independent of the federal government's purchases, and under treaty rights, he'd have the federal government pay for it. AstraZeneca says any third party offers of its vaccine are probably not legitimate. So what are you doing about this?
We've had many of conversations, Peter, with the chief and leadership in question, and we'll continue to examine any legitimate submission that they have to protect their people. My worry as Minister of Indigenous Services is the safety and well-being of Indigenous peoples. I indeed swore an oath to it. I know the chain of custody and the immense logistical work that Canada and all the machinery of government have put into place to ensure the integrity of that supply chain. It worries me tremendously. Yes, fraud, which is an element of great concern, but more importantly, the health and safety of Canadians, and imagine the compromise in that chain of custody that could occur if there were an illegitimate source getting into the country, and how that would increase the hesitancy that we've seen in Indigenous communities, but indeed in all of Canada. So we're scrutinizing it, and we have eyes on it. We do have the same questions that you've raised with respect to its legitimacy. All
right, we'll continue to follow that story as well. Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Peter.